Well, thank you very much for having me join this program. I'm excited today to talk about regrarians, which I'm a founder of, and what I'm calling the regenerative agroecology movement, and some of our work in viticulture. Um, I come from a part of Australia, which, as many of you would know, is a continent that was the first continent to be colonised by humans up to 120,000 years ago. I'm part of the live in a part of it called the Dja Dja Wurrung Nation, which has a climate very similar to lots of parts of the Mediterranean, particularly central and southern Spain, and has a very proud and continued Aboriginal history. Regrarians kicked off in 1993. Was when I started operating as a farm planning consultant. We started off doing a lot of work where we do farm planning and then we develop people's properties and then we'd manage them as well. Around 2001, we started doing educational programs. And that really went from strength to strength after about 2007, when we started to travel the world regularly doing farm planning programs. And we're quite well known for that now. With that and the digital revolution, we've developed what's called the Regrarians Workplace. We have 3,000 members from over 70 countries who are members of that workplace on all of the inhabited continents. And they practice all forms of what we might call regenerative agriculture or regenerative agroecology. And we have a lot of professional associates as well, and it's quite a dynamic space that we have managed and curated to help people who are starting out or who are going through some sort of a transition. Regrarians is also filmmakers. We produce the award-winning Polyphasis film, which I'm pleased to point out won the FICMA award some years ago in Barcelona, which we're very proud of. We also are producing a handbook called the Regrarians Handbook. I call it the Hands Book, though, because it's over 1,300 pages, so it takes two hands to carry this thing. It's quite big, but it's a detailed manual on all of the things that we're about. And the basis of the Regrarians program, if you like, is the Regrarians platform. It's a 10-layer platform that we've developed, and it has layers which really are about trying to be as comprehensive as possible when it comes to looking at how to plan and manage and lay out and implement regenerative agroecological systems. And the first layer is climate, and then there's geography, water, access, forestry, buildings, fences, soils, economy, and energy. When we look at those layers, they all help us to then go through some sort of priority check where we look at the layers, and for some people on some properties, on some projects, it's going to be the water layer that they really need to focus on. The water might not be infiltrating, or they need to, rainfall may not be infiltrating, or some people might need to look at the pipeline systems that they have for irrigation and so on. And then other projects might need to look at the building layer or the fencing layer, or their economy is really suffering, so they need to look at that layer or a few of these layers at once. So we try and help people to assess what layers they need to focus on. Within that, though, we look at the layers as being of different types. And so the climate and the geography layer are what we call the constitutional or framing layers. The climate of both your mind, the climate of regulation that you work within, and then the meteorological climate, which really frames what you can and can't do largely on a land shape, which is your geography, and how close you are to populations and so on. They're things that you can't really change much and are quite constitutional. And then we have what's called infrastructure and development layers, and they are things where you're going to do something, where you're going to put some infrastructure in, and that's the water layer, the access layer, forestry, buildings, fences, and energy layer. And then we have what's called the management layers. And this is where you're focusing more on management of infrastructure than actually installing it. So soils is one such, and so is the economy. Obviously, you can do things you can build a soils infrastructure by doing various things, but it really is a management layer as it is with the economy. All right. Now, I just put together a little mind map, as it were, of what I call the main expressions of regenerative agroecology. And there's a number of these, and they carry on from these different main themes. So when we look at the centre of this mind map, where we're saying we've got regenerative agroecology, well, then from that we've got horticulture, and from that we've also got livestock. We've got cereal production and grain legume production, and then we've got what I'm broadly calling agroforestry. Now, within each one of those strands of production, you've then got sub-strands. So in horticulture, we've got viticulture or vineyards, we've got orchard production, we've got vegetable production, and then in livestock, we've got different types of livestock production, where we've got people who follow the work of André Vassin, the great French ecologist, and then we've got people who follow Alan Savory in holistic management. And then when it comes to cereals and grains and grain legumes, we're looking at multi-species cover cropping, we're looking at pasture cropping, and we're looking at things like strip tillage. And then when you go to the next extent from them, different people who are using those different methods, some of them are integrating livestock, some of them are using biofertilizers, and so on. And then we've got agroforestry. In agroforestry, the main strands are where people are looking at doing things like high quality timber production. They're looking at doing fungi production, and they're looking at doing what we call silver pasture. And that's where you've got a blend of trees into pastoral systems where people are growing livestock and they're growing trees in the same space. And that sort of thing. So when we look at vineyards, which is what a lot of us are looking at with this particular program, the biggest things that people are doing in the regenerative agroecology movement are livestock integration. They're doing multi-species cover cropping, and they're doing biofertilizers and integrated pest management work. And similarly, when you look at orchards, vineyards and orchards are very similar in the way that they're managed in a lot of ways. We've got very similar outputs there. And then when it comes to vegetable production, people are doing no-till, they're doing biofertilizers. They're also doing bio-intensive systems following the Elliott Coleman model and John Jeevan's model, and so on. So when you look at the way people are expressing themselves, everybody is a different kind of producer. Some people are, as we call it, some people are plant people, some people are animal people. Some people are all of that together. They're mixed producers. But then if you're a plant person, some people are vine people. Some people like to do they like to do vines and orchards and cropping and animals all together. So, and of course, those people who are highly integrated are the rarest, because with agriculture and the trajectory of agriculture has been that is all about simplification. It's all about reducing the variables so that one can lead a simpler life, and the science of agronomy has really helped with that, particularly over the last 30 years. When we look at the Regrarians movement and people who are members of our organisation, I've got a slide here which I'm looking at called the expressions of the Regrarians world of regenerative agroecology. And I've broken that up into the different continents. So, and in the case of Australia and Aotearoa or New Zealand, broken those up together, because each of those different places have different nodes of activity. So if I look at Africa, for example, the main expressions of regenerative agroecology there are planned grazing and agroforestry. In Asia, the main expressions are agroforestry, biointensive vegetable production, and biofertilizer use. In South America, it's planned grazing and rational grazing, which are quite different. They have different origins. And then agroforestry, particularly now that with the advent of syntropic agroforestry or syntropic agriculture, and then multi-species cover cropping. And then when we look to Europe, there's planned grazing, rational grazing, agroforestry, and biointensive vegetable production are the main things that are being done there. And then Central America, Central America is one of the real hotspots of all of this type of work. Um, they do lots of biointensive vegetable production, lots of biofertilizers. It's one of the hotspots of biofertilizer research and innovation. Lots of agroforestry. It's one of the origins of agroforestry in indigenous systems, in fact. And then planned grazing and rational grazing on small and very broad acre scales. Australia is a bit similar to Central America. Lots of different innovation, planned grazing, pasture cropping, which is the concept of growing cereal and grain legume crops in existing perennial pastoral systems, multi-species cover cropping, which has come in more or less from the United States, biofertilizer use, biointensive vegetables, and agroforestry has long been a strong suit of this space in Australia. New Zealand, the biggest thing in New Zealand is really planned grazing and rational grazing and agroforestry in terms of their expression. And then in the United States and Canada, planned grazing, multi-species cover cropping, biointensive vegetables, and agroforestry. Now, of course, this is not an exclusive list. There's lots of people who, if you look at Europe, who are doing there's some people who are doing multi-species pasture cropping and so on. But these are the main nodes of use that we've seen through the people that we work with. When it comes to vineyards, vineyard work is not something that we've done a huge amount of over the last 30 years, but we have done some. And one of my first big clients actually, from about 1994, 95, were Tony and Nada Smark, and they don't own this property anymore. It had a freeway run through it, so they sold it. But in any case, what we did there was built a keyline style vineyard. Now, keyline is a method of water control planning that was developed in the 1940s and 50s here in Australia, and I'm an exponent of that. And there's particular patterns of row placement that you use in keyline planning, which in the case of this vineyard and in the forestry systems, which are also part of this project, have it so that the rows all fall away from the valley out towards the ridge. And it was interesting with this particular property when we put that row orientation in, that what happened was it also distributed the air differently. So the rows of vines actually drained not only water out to the drier ridges, but they also drained the cold air out onto the ridges and let the air exhaust off the property. That enabled the parts of the property which were quite frost prone to actually reduce in the amount of frost, which was a kind of a predicted outcome, but we didn't expect it to work as well as it did. And it was a really refreshing thing. So some Merlot that was marginal actually became profitable. So that was a really interesting project. Like I said, I haven't done many vineyards, and I've only got a few examples here. But another one that we're working with in Western Australia, which is quite a large vineyard, is the Voyager estate, and they're in the top one. Their Cabernet is in the top 100 wines in the world. It's a completely organic vineyard now. It's been transitioning for some time. And one of the great things they do on their property is, as a lot of people do in this space, is introduce cover crops and also introduce livestock in the form of sheep in this case. This area is renowned for its sheep production, particularly fine wool merino production. and they use a variety of different techniques to work with that. The grazing mostly because this is a winter rainfall dominant zone, so the grazing happens exclusively when the vines are dormant, and they rotate the animals through this vineyard over that period. That works really, really well. It's reduced their costs significantly in terms of the mowing cost that they had to do. And prior to that, as a lot of organic vineyards do, is that the primary tool of weed control is actually cultivation. And so that decreases the carbon levels of the soil and the water holding, water infiltration rates of the soil, and so on. So they've been slowly building up through the use of livestock and cover crops their organic carbon levels and the overall fertility of the system, and they're very happy with how that's impacted on their main game, which is wine, increasing wine quality. So they've done some innovative things. They've used different fencing strategies throughout the vineyard to help them, so that you don't have to keep setting up fences all of the time, because it's quite fiddly trying to install fences into a vineyard system, because most vineyards in Australia, at least, are on trellis systems. So a trellis is already a fence, and they've actually done some innovative stuff where they've added a fence to the trellis, and it's worked quite well. And they use other systems where which fit in with the overall layout and allow them to to quickly take the fence down and then put it back up, so it doesn't interfere with their general vineyard operations. We've got a colleague who I worked with in the 90s as well, who's continued to work on vineyards across California as well, Kelly Mulville. And Kelly is a holistic management professional, and he's done a lot of really great work over there, again with sheep in vineyards. What they've gone to the trouble with there is designing the vineyards from scratch from the outset, so that those vineyards are managed and trellised about for sheep. Whereas what normally happens with vineyards is that you come in, the vineyard's older and its trellising is set up in a particular way that didn't consider sheep, and then you go, oh, gee, I'd like to put sheep in there, and it's not necessarily set up for it. But that's something that Kelly's done a really good job with in this case at Piscini's Ranch, who we've done some work with too. And lastly, I'll just come a bit closer to home, and we did a 10-day farm planning workshop at Domaine de Mazy, which is in the Aude region of France, and it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, agroforestry or purpose-built agroforestry farm in France, and they've got some really beautiful systems there where they've integrated not only livestock in with their sheep production, with their vineyard production, but they've also got multi-row systems where they've got rows of almonds and then a few rows of vines, and then they've got rows of almonds and vines. So it's quite an integrated operation, as well as producing cereal in between and so on. That's all I've got for you. I thought that'd be just a little précis of what we get up to. And if you want more information, well then please head to regrarians.org, and we're very proud partners of AgroAssessor and Francesc, and all of the wonderful work that he and his colleagues find themselves doing across Europe. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today.